From the brutal forced killing of Chinese babies in the 1980s and 90s to live forced organ harvesting of religious dissidents, the Chinese Communist Party has no regard for human life. Stephen Mosher is the author of The Devil and Communist China. He personally witnessed some harrowing tales of forced abortion enforced under the command of the CCP. I sat down with him to unpack some of the regime's worst human rights abuses. Here's a look. Stephen Mosher, really an honor to sit down with you.
Well, thank you.
You've written extensively on China over the years. You were also one of the first American scholars granted access to do any type of in-depth research inside of China. Talk to us about what that experience was like and what you came to understand with your own eyes inside of communist China in the 70s.
Well, I arrived in China in March of 1979. I was part of the scholarly exchange group of 50 that was sent to China by the United States after we normalized diplomatic relations. I was the only one in that group allowed to do unsupervised research among the Chinese people themselves. You know, when I went to China, I had been educated at Stanford University. And we had a number of people at Stanford University who were very, very much admirers of the Chinese Communist Party and of Chairman Mao. We had Professor John Gurley in the economics department writing books about how wonderful Mao's economic plans were and how the communes had greatly improved the lives of the Chinese people. We had the former Democrat candidate Kamala Harris's father, Professor Harris at Stanford, who was also a big believer in the success of communist China's effort to create a new socialist man and a new socialist woman. And so those were kind of the attitudes that I took with me when I went to China. It didn't take very long for the Chinese people to convince me that all of that was simply a fantasy created in the minds of Western socialist-minded people. Really, the reality on the ground was a brutal reminder of what communism is like in action. Because one of the things that happened after I arrived in China was, first of all, I was taken out by a new friend of mine to a little hill outside the village. And he said this was the hill where, when the Red Army came into the village, they executed all of the former clan elders and the former members of the local militia. Now, every village had a militia because that was the local police force to protect them from robbers and bandits. They were all executed. All the guns were confiscated, and the leaders of the village were executed, and new leaders were appointed by the Chinese Communist Party. That was kind of a wake-up call. On top of all this, and we're talking about human rights violation after human rights violation, tyranny after tyranny, brutality after brutality, the one-child policy began when I was in the village. The new policy was that the population of Guangdong province could not be allowed to increase more than 1% in the year 1980. And so I said, well, what are you going to do? And the secretary of the Communist Party committee said, it's very simple. We'll do a house-to-house search of the village. We'll identify all of the women who are pregnant with illegal second and third and fourth children. And then we will tell them they must get abortions. Communist officials would say things like, you there who are 9 months pregnant, don't think you can simply stay in this lockup until you give birth, because we will not allow you to take your baby home. Should you go into labor before you give us permission to do an abortion, we will simply kill your baby at birth. I went with these women as they were taken to the local medical clinic and aborted by cesarean section. Again, most of them were 7, 8, 9 months pregnant. They decided to do two things to stop these babies from being born, to stop the population of Guangdong province from increasing, right? First, they gave a lethal injection into the womb to kill the unborn child. And then 24 to 48 hours later, they would do the cesarean section abortion and remove the now dead or dying baby. But there were women who were brought in at the last minute in labor, too late to give the poison shot into the womb. So what would they do with those? They would take a hypodermic needle, fill the syringe with alcohol or formaldehyde, and wait until the baby's head was crowning. Babies were mostly born head first. And they would inject the alcohol or formaldehyde into the fontanelle, the soft spot in the child's head, and the child would die in convulsions seconds, minutes later. And after they were forcibly aborted, they then would sterilize them. They would do a tubal ligation to make sure these violators would never come back in following years pregnant with another illegal child. So they took away the prospect of any future babies being born. And there was, in the 80s and 90s, and until the one-child policy ended, there was an epidemic of suicide in China, which, when in most countries, most suicides are men, elderly men. In China, the suicides were mostly young women. Why were they committing suicide? They were committing suicide because the Communist Party had forcibly aborted a baby they conceived in love, and they couldn't get over the loss, and so they ended their lives in consequence. And I decided I would do what I could to let America and the world know what was really happening in China. This didn't come without a cost, of course, and the cost was that Stanford was forced by the Chinese Communist Party to choose between me and continuing ties with China. Literally, they were told that your scholarly exchange agreement with China between Stanford and the Ministry of Education will be ended unless you punish Stephen Mosher severely. And punish me they did. They sent me packing.
There's been horrific revelations over the past decade in the 2000s of the allegations of forced live organ harvesting inside of China of prisoners, religious prisoners of conscience, whether they be Falun Gong or now the Uyghurs and others. A lot of people's reaction to that is just simply, and there's been films titled with regard to this topic, hard to believe. Based on what you've seen with your own eyes inside of China, do you think that this crime that we're speaking of is possible?
Oh, I think forced organ harvesting in China is a big business because, you see, they have literally a captive population of people to harvest from. Many years ago, looked into this whole topic in depth because it was of a piece with the other human rights violations that I had earlier studied in China and documented. And I became convinced that Falun Gong, first and foremost, but also other political prisoners of conscience and other minorities were being tissue typed when they were arrested. And if they were a tissue match for a Communist Party official who needed a new heart or lung or liver or cornea, that they would be killed for that purpose. I also did research and because into a procedure called ECMO, which is extracorporeal membranous oxygenation. One of my sons was born prematurely and had to have this artificial heart-lung machine, this extracorporeal membranous oxygenation, used to allow his lungs to mature so he could live, and he's quite well and healthy now. He's 30 years old. But this technology was taken to China by a particular doctor and now is used to make organ harvesting even more profitable, because before the advent of this heart-lung machine procedure, you could just harvest a heart, but by the time you harvested the heart, the other organs would have started decaying. Now what you do is you use the extracorporeal oxygenation to continue the blood flow to the organs while you cut off the blood flow to the brain, killing the donor, but allowing you to harvest not just a heart or a liver, but a heart and a liver and a lungs and all the other organs as well, because it keeps the organs perfused with blood. This was the technology. It came from the United States, invented to save lives, which is now being used to make forced organ harvesting in China even more profitable for the communist officials in charge. I have told officials at the Vatican, I have told officials at the U.S. State Department, I have testified before the British Parliament on human rights abuses in China, including kinds of abuses. I am absolutely convinced that forced organ harvesting began decades ago, and it has gotten more common and more sophisticated over the years, and that people are being deliberately killed in China for their organs. And the only thing you need to know to prove that is happening is that you can order a heart or transplant in advance. That can only happen if someone is killed for the purpose of providing you with that heart. You see, because everywhere else in the world, you sign up and you wait.
Months, if not years.
Months, if not years, for a transplant. In China, you sign up and they say, come on October 16th, and we will have your new heart ready and waiting for you. The only way that can happen is if they're killing someone in order to provide that heart for you. So we need to ban people from going to China for organ transplants, because everyone who goes to China for an organ transplant is complicit in the death of an innocent in China.
There's a discussion among scholars, China watchers, China scholars, or a debate whether or not the dictator, Xi Jinping, is in complete and total control, or if he's paranoid about losing control. What do you think is the state of politics inside of China?
What we have in China today is an economy that's faltering. It's faltering. Why? It's faltering for three reasons. One, because of the demographic decline. Those hundreds of millions of young people who should be getting married and buying homes and cars aren't there. So there's 70 million empty apartment buildings in China which will not be occupied ever, because the people who would have occupied them and raised families are gone forever. The second thing is, of course, all the misdirected government investment into white elephants, the state-owned enterprises that continue to lose money each year, like China Rail, for example, which is hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. That debt will never be paid off. And then you've got the tariff pressure, the pressure from the tariffs of Donald Trump. The only sector of the Chinese economy that actually works according to market principles is the export sector. And the export sector only works because of access to the American market. And they've got nothing else. They've got no domestic consumption, in part because of the one-child policy, in part because nobody in China trusts the government. They want to hold on to their capital or get it out of the country as quickly as possible and buy a safe investment like a home in California or a home in Sydney. The Chinese economy is in for some very, very dark days ahead. And I believe that the sooner the collapse comes, the sooner Xi Jinping will be forced, as Mao was, to either step back to what he called the second line or to be forced out of power altogether. He's alienated all of the other factions in China. He's alienated the followers of Jiang Zemin by purging members of his faction. He's alienated Hu Jintao's faction. In fact, he had Hu removed for health reasons from a meeting in front of the assembled senior leaders. That was tremendous loss of face for Hu Jintao, tremendous. So he's alienated the factions in the Communist Party, leaving only his own, he wanted to leave only his own faction standing, and yet recently members of his own faction, generals that he's appointed, have been removed. That makes no sense. It makes no sense for Xi Jinping himself, who has only the support of his faction, to begin removing members of that faction. So I think that the pressure from the other elite families in China, and we're talking about families that go back to the Long March. We're talking about families that are now, third, fourth generation Communist Party elites. If those families unite together, they can remove Xi Jinping. And so right now I think that his days are numbered. He will either be put out to pasture or simply sidelined in one way or another. And the evidence seems to be that in terms of at least control of the military, he's not in total control.
I want to revisit something that you mentioned when it came to your research and your time in China, where it came to a head and basically an ultimatum was given. Is that something that is still prominent, whether it be in media, if you have a bureau, if you're a Western media organization inside of China, as well as China scholars that really enjoy the access, whether it is a junket or some type of research that they want to do in China where you have to toe a certain line? Is there a concern that we've been contaminated as a society?
Well, I've been concerned about this for a very, very long time because we have in the United States an open society. And we also, because of our Judeo-Christian heritage, I think always try to assume the best of people. That operating principle doesn't work very well with regard to China, because one has to assume that the communist official that you're dealing with is being duplicitous unless you have evidence that he's being honest. In order to be on good terms with the Chinese Communist Party, you have to play nice. You have to say nice things about them. And if you do, you get invited on all expense paid junkets to China. You get visa, of course. First and foremost, you get a visa to go to China, and then you get an all expense paid trip to China. You would think that if they were to give up on anyone, they would give up on me, because I've been a critic of China since 1980 and will continue until my death. They have tried to get me to come to China. They have offered me all expense paid trips to China. They have offered me a visa. They have offered me lecture fees. They have tried to compromise me. Now, if they try to compromise me, they'll try to compromise anybody. For many years, I held conferences on human rights in China, annual conferences. And I always invited members, representatives from the Falun Gong, because they are right there, first and foremost, among the groups who are being persecuted in China. I would invite China scholars to join me at these conferences. And more often than not, they would turn me down. And I don't want to mention names. They're famous names in the China scholarly community. But they would tell me, no, I want to keep my channels of communication open to China. I don't want to criticize the regime. So the Chinese Communist Party is very, very good at manipulating public opinion, at making sure that the people that it allows into China are hewing the party line and come back to spew party propaganda, or at least not say anything critical of communist China. Think about the fact that China is still allowed to purchase inserts into major American newspapers and run propaganda articles. I don't think we've been able to place, and our Voice of America hasn't been able to place an article in the People's Daily for I don't know how long. I mean, reciprocity. We shouldn't be allowing that. Think about the fact that radio stations here are owned or controlled by Communist Party interests. I was involved in 1998 in the Cox Commission, which investigated the effort of China in the late 1990s to set up espionage shops in the United States. And at that time, Chris Cox, who was the head of the Cox Commission, estimated that there were 10,000 Communist Party front organizations set up in the United States. That was 27 years ago. How many front organizations of various kinds do we have now? Many more than 10,000. We are at war with China across all domains except the kinetic. People need to realize that. In cyberspace, we're at war with China. China just set up a network of phony cell stations in New York City that would have taken down the entire communication system in the largest city in the United States. That's an incredibly aggressive thing to do. It is, at one level, an act of war. China is at war with us across all domains, all the time. It is ceaseless. I think the solution has to be strict reciprocity. If China is engaged in actions against us, then we tell them, unless we are allowed to do the same thing in China, you must stop. unless we're allowed to open up a George Washington Institute on the Beijing University campus, they have to close down all of the Confucius Institutes. Well, since they will never allow us to do that, then the Confucius Institutes will be closed down. But we didn't do it. They did it by refusing reciprocity, you see. Unless we're able to publish a newspaper in Shanghai and distribute it freely to the Chinese people, they can't publish their newspapers here. Unless we're allowed to own a radio station and broadcast news and information from our viewpoint, from the American viewpoint, they're not allowed to own radio stations here. And on, across the board. United Front measures. Remember, the United Front Department is a department of the Chinese Communist Party. It is a weapon that the Chinese Communist Party is using, along with propaganda and along with People's Liberation Army, in order to achieve world domination. And their path to world domination runs through one country, and one country alone. Only one country stands in the way of China's domination of the world, and that is the United States.